Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar in Sustainable Conservation's Solutions in Our Soil webinar series. Thank you all for joining us today. And thank you also to our generous sponsors, Environmental Science Associates, Spotswood Estate Vineyard and Winery, and Iron Horse Winery. Thank you for supporting our Spring 2023 webinar series and for sharing Sustainable Conservation's vision of stewarding our most precious natural resources for all Californians. My name is Ryan Flaherty, and I'm Sustainable Conservation's Director of Circular Economies. Before I introduce our special guests, I wanted to give some background on sustainable conservation and our work on soils and water. For those of you that don't know us, Sustainable Conservation advances the collaborative stewardship of California's land, air, and water for the benefit of nature and people. And we and our partners are working in many ways to advance more resilient water systems in California, from groundwater recharge to accelerating restoration to rethinking how we utilize nutrients and agricultural byproducts, among others. And one common thread among all of this work is soil. Soil and soil health practices can provide many benefits, including healthier and more resilient watersheds. Soils can help slow down water and get it back into the ground, which is critical as we face more extreme precipitation and flooding here in California, as we've seen over this past winter. Soils can also help hold water for later use, which is critical as we face more prolonged droughts. And they can help retain nutrients in the root zone, reducing runoff and leaching that is essential for us to protect community drinking water. So thus the name of our webinar series, Solutions in Our Soils. In the first two webinars, we talked about what soil health is, the science behind water-related benefits of soils, and soil's role in supporting policy and environmental justice efforts. For this webinar and our next one, we're switching to implementation. Given these benefits, what can we do to increase adoption of soil health practices on farms? I'm really excited for today's conversation, which focuses on how supply chains can influence farmer adoption of soil health practices. Before I introduce our guests, we'd like to get a sense of who you are, who's in the audience. So we have a few questions we'd like you to respond to in a Zoom poll. And if you don't see your answer reflected in one of the choices, please feel free to put your answer in the chat. So the questions are, where are you joining us from? What describes your affiliation or the organization that you're with? And how would you rate your level of knowledge of how supply chains can influence adoption of soil health practices? So we'll give about a minute here for everyone to put in your answers. We're getting close. Wait about 15 more seconds. If you haven't yet, go ahead and put your answers in the poll. Okay, we'll go ahead and close out the poll now. Very interesting. We have a good number of people from the Bay Area in California, the Sacramento Valley, San Joaquin Valley, and Southern California, but a big chunk that's from out of state or others. So it's great to have you all listening in as we talk about soils and water in California. We also have a good mix of organizations across the spectrum, and most people here are either rate themselves as beginner or average on the topic of supply chains and soil health practices. So thank you all for responding there. Now that we know who you are, I'd like to introduce our esteemed guests. So first, we have Dan Sonke with Blue Diamond Growers. As Senior Director of Sustainability, Dan leads sustainability for Blue Diamond Growers, the cooperative of almond farmers behind the Blue Diamond Almonds brand. And prior to Blue Diamond, he spent 10 years at Campbell Soup Company, developing their approach to sustainable agriculture. And prior to that, he was in various roles related to sustainable agriculture. Dan grew up working on his family's almond farm in California's San Joaquin Valley and is now based in the Sacramento area. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Second, we have Claire Loudis with Olam Spices, or OFI. Claire is the Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability Manager at OFI. In this role, Claire is responsible for the sustainability strategy and product development across 5 countries and 15 crops. Prior to OFI, Claire worked with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA, and then with Ceres, where she provided investors with data on the water risk management of major food and beverage companies. When she's not traveling around the state or the world for work, she's based in Fresno, California. And last, and certainly not least, John McKeon with Taylor Farms. John is the Director of Organic Integrity at Taylor Farms, where he oversees organic programs for farm, harvest, and processing businesses. He's worked at Taylor Farms and Earthbound Farms for 14 plus years, doing almost everything from food safety to organic integrity, international supply chain compliance, ag operations, sustainability programs, and quality assurance. Prior to Taylor and Earthbound Farms, John spent 10 years working at CCOF Certification Services, and he lives with his family on the Central Coast of California. So welcome to all of you. It's great to have you. So we're going to spend about the next 45 minutes or so in conversation with each other, and then we'll save time at the end to answer some questions from the audience. So if you're in the audience, please add your questions to the Q&A box. You'll see a chat box and a Q&A box. Please add your questions to the Q&A box as we're talking. And when we get towards the end of the webinar, we'll answer as many of those questions as we can. So let's get started. So, as we think about increasing adoption of soil health practices to improve the resiliency of our food system here in California and beyond, it's not just about farmers. Our agricultural supply chains are a critical component for farmer success. Most of the food that we all eat passes through many steps between the farm and our fork. This can include aggregators, processors, shippers, and restaurant or retail, among others. So Claire, John, and Dan, with you all here today, not only do we have deep expertise, but we also have a variety of perspectives. We have different regions, different crops, and different parts of the supply chain. So to start us off, I was wondering if each of you could give a brief overview of your company, where it sits in the supply chain, and why soil health is important to your company. So let's start with Dan, then Claire, and then John.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Sustainable Conservation, for the opportunity to be here. Blue Diamond Growers is a very interesting company that I love working for. You mentioned I grew up on an almond farm. Blue Diamond Growers is a cooperative. So it's an unusual corporate structure where the farmers actually own the company. They have a membership in the cooperative, and my family farm is actually still to this day a member of the cooperative. So added personal pleasure to work for the co-op for me, but the co-op is cool to work for even if you don't have that connection. We are functionally a nonprofit. That means, how is that possible? Well, we actually give all the profits of the company, allocate them back to every member farm at the end of the fiscal year. So the profits are all passed on, allocated by the volume that the farmers bring us. So the farmers have ownership. We're vertically integrated. We have a portfolio of almond products. We are the largest almond processor in the world. We provide the Blue Diamond branded products, the Almond Breeze almond milk, the snack nuts, the gluten-free nut thin crackers. Those are some of our core brands, but then we also have a very large international business in ingredients, every form of almonds from sliced and diced to almond oil, almond protein powder, things like that. So a vertical integration, an unusual connection to the farms through their ownership structure, and an international reach as a large company. So we have an interesting place in the industry.
And could you just mention, Dan, just real briefly, kind of why soils are important to Blue Diamond?
Yeah, so absolutely. Soils are important to us because we are a multi-generational company. Multi-generational farmers own the cooperative, and the soils, of course, are the source of where our orchards start. We want to see our farmers have a thriving future in everything that we do, from the financial profitability that we provide to them, but also to the environmental responsibility that they have to care for their orchard. And also, of course, in our ability to communicate that responsibility, that environmental responsibility, to the marketplace. That is very important to us globally. So for all of those reasons, we increasingly are focusing attention on soil health.
Thanks, Dan. Claire?
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks, Sustainable Conservation. As Ryan said, I'm here representing Olam Food Ingredients. We are a global agribusiness made up of 5 individual businesses: coffee, cocoa, nuts, dairy, and spices. And I'm embedded in the spices team based out of Fresno, California. And in spices, globally, we work with farmers and process spices in India, Brazil, Vietnam, Egypt, and the US. And in the US, we co-farm and process onion, garlic, parsley, and red chili for dehydration, and then fresh green chilies. And we breed a specialty seed specific for dehydration and do the planting and the harvesting with our own labor and machinery, contracting with farmers starting in the Imperial and Palo Verde valleys, and then up in the Central Valley, moving further up the coast to Tule Lake, and then in Boardman, Oregon as well. And so the farmers we contract with, of course, do the growing. And then we also have 6 processing facilities in California, Nevada, New Mexico. So for around soil health, as OFI, we have corporate goals around regenerative ag and soil health. So we're aiming to bring 2 million hectares of land into regen ag by 2030. So sorry, that's the size of Costa Rica. It's hard to visualize hectares sometimes, but it's a huge area of land. And then as spices, our whole co-farming model is sort of based on protecting soil health, because since we don't own our farms, in order to support a healthy rotation, we won't have alliums return to the same field for 4 years or more. So we prioritize soil health in order to improve crop quality and yields. And additionally, as a processor, we're invested in California and all of the places we operate and the families we grow with. And so we want to make sure that we can farm here for a long time. And what that means, similar to what Dan said, is we need to take care of our resources, our water and our soil.
Thanks, Claire. And before we pass it to John, could you explain to the audience what alliums are?
Onions and garlic.
Thank you. Thank you. And John?
Yeah, hello, everybody. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Sustainable Conservation, again, for the opportunity to be here and with Dan and Claire. Good company for sure. My name is John McKeon. I am the Director of Organic Integrity and Compliance at Taylor Farms. I've been at Taylor since 2019 when Taylor Farms acquired Earthbound Farms. A long history of the Earthbound Farms and as an organic inspector prior to that. Taylor Farms is probably a pretty well-known grower-shipper, classic grower-shipper model of brassicas, lettuces, beans, celery, peas, and whatnot throughout the Salinas Valley region. We farm down in the Imperial Valley and over in Yuma, and then down in the desert in Baja and down in central Mexico with all of those crops, kind of similar to Claire, where we're chasing the sun down the coast and then back up on our seasonal production. We also then take all of our products from our production regions, and we have facilities in Yuma, Baja, Central Mexico, Canada, and about 21 facilities throughout the United States where we do forward processing or actual processing for various numbers of kind of bagged salad, fresh cut items that we're producing, as well as a field pack program for that as well. In terms of soil health, our produce production is really an intense cultivation and production system. So we're working grounds on a seasonal basis to try and get 2.5, 3 turns out of that ground. So we kind of understand that we're using that ground quite a bit, and we have an inherent responsibility to maintain the soil health of that. The organic system plays greatly into that system, and so we utilize a lot of ecosystem services and other things within our organic system production to essentially maintain our healthy soils. On the conventional side, we're really turning towards soil health in a more stringent manner. We have lots of regulations and lots of consumer and customer requests to kind of split that line between a quality, safe product and maintaining the soils and the farming operations that we have for years to come. So let's, we are really, as Dan said earlier, turning our focus towards healthy soils, and with an intensity that I think where we are currently today, technology and information is adding to our knowledge of the interactions of healthy soils and the ability to essentially implement better practices.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. And I'll do the same for you. You mentioned brassicas. Could you tell the audience what brassicas are?
Yeah, broccoli, cauliflower, cole crops, most commonly referred to as.
Great, thank you. And I don't think I could have asked someone to tee up the next part of this better than what you just mentioned, John, around the requirements through the supply chain. So we'll kind of get started by talking about some of the challenges to scaling adoption in the supply chain, and then we'll move into solutions and some of the things that you all are doing. So, despite the many benefits of soil health practices, adoption in California remains relatively low. It's around 5% on average, give or take, depending on the soil health practice and the crop that you're talking about. And sustainable conservation has spent a lot of time over the past few years talking to different stakeholders, including farmers and technical assistance providers and food and beverage companies about some of the barriers to adoption and what we can do to scale adoption of soil health practices. And supply chains rise to the top as both a challenge and a solution. And within that, one thing we hear is that supply chain contracts or requirements for farmers can sometimes conflict with the supply chain's very own soil health goals that you talked about. And within that, so we want to talk a little bit more about that. Within that, one of the most frequently mentioned supply chain requirements that can impede adoption of some of these practices is food safety. Which is a really important topic, obviously, as we think about our food. And John, you've worked on food safety and have a long history. So I was wondering if you could give the audience a brief history of food safety concerns in California and the supply chain requirements that emerged as a result of those concerns. So take us back in time a little bit. Yeah.
Go backing in the time. I'll start around 2006. For me, that was the spinach outbreak that happened in California. That was actually on a transitional piece of ground under earthbound management, even though it was dole product. With that, obviously, we had the spinach outbreak, and it impacted 218 people, killed 5 people, huge impact to produce, and a big light shined on the need for food safety in leafy greens production for sure, and probably shining a light on food safety across all of agricultural production based on that event. Well, we have, so based on that event, California and Arizona quickly leaped into a marketing agreement to essentially develop industry metrics to address food safety in lieu of the Food Safety Modernization Act or individual states implementing food safety requirements. So what we ended up with was the Leafy Greens marketing agreement and the metrics and audits therein. Which set up essentially customer or audits of our operations and anyone that was a signatory to the Leafy Greens food safety requirement. And audits happened in 2007 and went great. We saw great improvement over food safety practices and implementation for a long time. And then we hit 2018 and we had a romaine outbreak, and we had consecutive Leafy Greens outbreaks after that as well. And I think what happened there is, and all the time we're also making this turn towards sustainable agriculture is also impacting the world right now. And so what we have is this focus on food safety and the realization that LGMA was or common food safety metrics were just not enough. And so what we had is the entry of retailers and our food service providers entering that space and upping the requirements. And so now we have metrics that kind of confuse the space a little bit. They certainly impact operations and farming, but more importantly, when we're looking at soil health in general, some of those food safety restrictions now limit what we're holding now in our other hand based on customer requests and consumer requests is the need to create a sustainable future for farming and certainly farm sustainably. So now we have, I can use an example here of an issue here. So a common thing that I'm running into is the use of insectary plantings and cover crops. So cover crops, obviously we know the benefits of that, returning organic matter to the soil, building soil health, and even improving nutrition and water retention. The problem with that is getting that cover crop turned down in time and understanding whether or not in the turn down you're creating a biological risk. Additionally to that, when you have cover crops, sometimes the fear is, and there is some validity to it, is that you're creating habitat, and habitat that would be rodents, birds, other things. And so you have to approach that in a system of management. Insectary plantings is the same way. Typically we would plant out an entire sprinkler row in alyssum or cilantro and use that for a beneficial insectary attractant to control thrips and aphids in our product. What happens when you let a whole row of alyssum go all season long? It gets big and suddenly you have habitat again created. Perceived risk and actual risk is now where we're at, I think, in this space, where we're finally getting some science and data and really based on collaboration with a lot of partners to see what the actual risks are here in the space. So I'm encouraged by that as we kind of try and split this fine line between obviously having a deep responsibility for food safety and safe products for consumers, but really looking strongly at the future of agriculture and our resource management therein. So I'll stop there.
So you mentioned, cover crops as one practice that can be challenging sometimes, and there's uncertainty around food safety, as well as integrated pest management or trying to build up beneficial pests to then take care of, pests that could do harm to the crops. Claire, I was wondering if you had any other examples, and then Dan, you can chime in after that if you have another example.
Sure. Yeah, something we're seeing in our supply chains that sort of mimics that same pull between two different outcomes, wanting to have a safe, healthy product and then also wanting to support soil health is around compost. So, I think there's the majority of dairies in the country are in California. And so there's this availability of composted dairy manure that we know is good for our soils. And our growers are itching to use it, especially because of increases in fertilizer price, synthetic fertilizer prices. And so it's just this wonderful available resource that we are actually promoting as a regenerative ag practice, and something that we ourselves and then also some of our customers down the supply chain want to encourage. But at the same time, our contract says that we can't grow on a field that has had compost in the last 5 years, which is pretty extreme. And so we're working to change that contract and making sure we're doing it in a very thoughtful way. So dictating the quality that the compost has to be, what kind of processes and procedures it has to go through for testing. And then we're working closely with our food safety teams, our processing teams internally, and our ag teams to make sure that we can make that change, but at the same time that everybody's on board, that the science supports that it can be a healthy alternative. And in fact, we've found that we had more hits from salmonella from our organic product than from our conventional product. Switch that, from our conventional product than from our organic product, which is already using compost. So that's been a challenge, but it's pretty encouraging to know that all of the teams internally are supportive of this practice, even the food safety team, especially the food safety team. And so we just have to figure out how to kind of share that risk, make sure that if something is rejected, it doesn't go back and kind of hit the grower and they're responsible. And then also connecting with our suppliers upstream, or our customers upstream, to make sure that if they're asking for these kinds of practices, that they'll also engage with us and make clear what their priorities are through their sales teams, their own food safety teams, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I can just chime in quickly. The almond industry has a very parallel example right now where animals or animal manure in the orchards conflict with an established USDA regulatory requirement that the industry put in place for pasteurization of almonds going into the domestic market. And all of that, those procedures that are required under regulation are predicated on no manure and no animals being in the orchard. And so when people advocate adding those things back into the system, before we can do that as an industry, we would have to rework the science behind the food safety regulations. And so there's this conflict that has to be worked through before some of these things can be modified. If you don't mind, I'll just shift to another example that's not food safety related. Yeah, I'm sure that everybody on the panel has experienced this in California, where when we advocate putting cover crops in an orchard, for example, in almonds or on other crops in California, one of the first questions that farmers raise is, where's the water going to come from to get these things off the ground? Because they do require some water to get started, especially in a drought situation. So that's one of the most common questions that comes up for Californians. Cover cropping and soil health is, what are the water implications of establishing the cover crop? Even if we think down the road that increased soil health is going to have a benefit on water holding capacity or efficiency, a barrier to adoption is always that perceived water cost to the practices.
Yeah,
other folks want to bring that up.
Thanks for bringing that up, Dan. It's a pretty critical component there, which is the growers. I'm sure it's the same for you, but growers are both gamblers and risk averse, right? They gamble on the things they know, and they're risk averse on the things that they don't know and don't want to ruin their bottom line ultimately. And so, yeah, utilizing water, or finding the water, especially in our growing regions, from the Salinas Valley to the Imperial Desert, down into Yuma in Mexico, it will be the conversation going forward in the future, especially now we know what we've done with the Colorado River watershed and how water is going to play out a little bit here going forward.
Yeah, I appreciate that example, Dan. And that's something that we're working on trying to, and the other added complexity is with the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and how those decisions that are being made at the local level might influence farmer decision making around how they use water and whether they use it on cover crops. So we're all kind of working together to try to, as the previous example around food safety, to understand, it's obviously we want to make sure we're managing water resources really well, and we also want to understand the science about, cumulatively what's the benefit as we think about the total water cycle. So just a couple rapid fire. Are there any other quick examples you might give before we move on around supply chain kind of requirements that can create challenges for grower adoption?
Go ahead, Dan.
Claire looked like she was ready to chime in. So
I mean, I was just mine is crop specific, but cover crops is a real challenge. No tillage. A lot of these requirements or not requirements, but things we know are good for the soil, minimizing soil disturbance, are just very complicated or almost impossible to implement in certain systems. So we grow root crops, and so figuring out, and it's a mechanized system, right, in large scale farming. So figuring out how to incorporate cover crops aside from the water challenges, but also when to kill them, or the cost of seed, and figuring out how to put those in the field, as well as and then the biodiversity challenges that come with that as well. I heard one grower who I think might be on the call, their land abuts a watershed, or watershed. And they say when they get audited, if it's food safety, they try to shoo the birds away. And if it's for, biodiversity or sustainability audits, they'll try to welcome the birds to come. But just the complexity of incorporating these competing requests, I guess, from food safety, from soil health, and from just inherently what the farming system is. So a root crop, we can't do no tillage, but we'd like to, we want to incorporate those soil health activities.
So I hear in there kind of underlying complexity, both, is what's relevant for a given grower and a given crop in a given circumstance, and then balancing different outcomes or needs, as the example of kind of food safety versus some of these soil health practices are about moving back to more natural systems, and that creates a lot of unknowns, which can be a challenge for supply chains. So and on that, and we can come back to some of these if we have time later, but Claire, with that example, you kind of started also getting into what I wanted to talk about next, which is kind of measuring and rewarding grower performance. So that's another important role that supply chains can and should play, is recognizing those growers that have improved practices compared to others, and ideally rewarding them. And yet that is a lot easier said than done. So I'd love to spend a little bit time talking about the challenges of, one, understanding grower performance. So that kind of gets to Claire, what you were saying about variability. What might be relevant for an onion grower may not be relevant for an almond grower, or southern San Joaquin Valley versus Central Coast. Those practices might look very different. So what is that? What is good for a given grower? How do you know who your growers are? And then how do you find rewards, kind of reward them in your supply chain? So that's a big topic, and I'll just let you all share what you will. Maybe Dan, starting with you, kind of something that's top of mind for you in that area.
Sure. I mean, we have no problem knowing who our growers are because they're our owners. We spend a lot of time interacting with them, but there are 3,000 of them. And because of our structure, we are the home of the small scale almond farmer in California. So our average farm size has less than 100 acres of almonds. So some of those are farmers who farming is their second career. They have a day job. So, reaching those farmers, interacting with those farmers is different from those who are full-time, of which, of course, we have a very large percentage of our farmers as well who are full-time farmers. But there's complex interactions depending on who they are. Because they're our owners, we don't dictate to them how to farm. It's not a contractual relationship in the same way as other companies have, but we do have influence, and we can communicate to them where the market's going and educate on the science that's evolving that can help them understand the best practices for their operations. The other thing we can do is incentivize. So we've actually taken that route recently, where we've created a financial incentive for growers who participate in our sustainable agriculture program. They can actually get a higher price per pound of almonds when they deliver their nuts to us. So that has been very effective at getting farmers to engage, as you can imagine, especially in an era right now where we're in low almond prices back to the farm from the global market. So we created a higher price per pound of almond, choose stages. If you engage in just a self-assessment program that's educational and sharing data with the co-op and the industry, that's the first stage. It's very helpful for us. It also provides an educational element. There's a wide array of best practices focused on soil health in that program. But then the higher tier of financial payback from that program involves doing a carbon assessment of your farm, which further exposes you to knowledge of how some of these soil practices interact with your carbon footprint. And then also, if you get bee-friendly farming certified, which is focused on pollinators, but often involves planting cover crops for pollinator benefits. And that, of course, introduces you to the benefits that come along with those for soil health as well. So that's the first step of our financial incentive. And then the second step is underway right now. We are in the process of kicking off a grant-funded program, USDA grant-funded program, $45 million across tens of thousands of acres of our membership to advance climate smart agriculture. So we'll be doing lots and lots of cover crops, something called whole orchard recycling, which involves putting the carbon from an orchard back into the soil at the end of its lifespan for carbon capture, but also immense soil benefits coming from that. And then hedgerows and conservation planting. So all carbon and biodiversity focused, but also with soil health benefits. That'll be over the next 5 years. It's a big effort, but we're really excited to get that kicked off with our growers. So we'll be cost sharing those practices, to be clear, with the growers.
That's so exciting, Dan. And I'll just note that I think all of you're here today have I guess relative. Well, I know Dan has complete visibility, but pretty good visibility into the growers as compared to some others that might sit either in different supply chains, commodity crops, where those go into processors is very hard to trace back to the field level, or just different levels of the supply chain. If you're a brand, for example, it might be very hard for you to figure out exactly, which growers your crops are coming from. So that visibility to grower level traceability is a big challenge in supply chain. You all just happen to sit a little closer to the growers, so I just wanted to call that out. Claire, I'm wondering if you have any other examples that you can share.
Sure. So similar to Dan, we co-farm again. So our growers aren't owners, but they own their own businesses and we work closely. We can't tell them what to do. But we also have an at-source platform, which is our proprietary sustainability and traceability tool. And basically what we do with that is we try to measure the climate footprint, including cultural practices, chemical applications, pesticides, transportation, processing. All of those different variables go into this calculation so we can understand the emission factor for a product coming from a specific region. And then we also can do the water footprint and social footprint as well, or social metrics. And so We're using that to measure some of our soil health projects. So working with our farmers closely to, again, as I was saying before, try to understand if we make it so they can apply compost, what are the differences in soil organic matter? How does that affect yield and quality? How does that affect their carbon footprint? And so on and so forth. And so we're hoping to use that as a tool to show the difference and then help farmers get rewarded downstream. So help use that as a showcase to our customers about an improved product, a low carbon product, an insanely traceable product. And then hope that this at-source tool can help to maybe give premiums, lead to premiums going to our growers, or incentivize more projects and project funding there. But one of the challenges is a lot of these measurements require multiple years on the same field. If we really want to understand impacts and changes in the soil, we can't just measure in one season. And we are an allium, we're garlic and onion. So again, we rotate, we won't return to the same field for about 4 years to support a healthy rotation. But that being said, we can do these practices on one field, but then measure it after 1 year, but you won't really see changes, and we won't be able to continue working the same land with those great practices, biologicals, compost, cover cropping, things like that, and see those changes. And so that's been a challenge in implementing some of these soil health projects. And so we're trying to figure out how to have more of that whole farm approach. So whether it's partnering with other processors, tomato is a popular crop in some of our rotations in the Central Valley, for example. So maybe hooking up with our growers who also grow tomato and those processors and figuring out, how do we continue these projects on the same field year over year? So that's been a challenge, but we're thinking of solutions.
And I'll just say, Claire, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Olam OFI is kind of a B2B, a business to business. And so when I talk about some of the brands that have these sustainability goals and they don't really necessarily have visibility, in some cases, Olam is playing that role of trying to translate what's happening to the growers into what those brands are looking for. So you're kind of sitting in the middle and trying to help articulate some of those sustainability or soil health practices and provide those to the brands.
Totally. Yeah. So many times if a customer has a story about their growers in their annual report, it's our growers and our story. But at the same time, if they're not interested they're looking for something to put on a product, some kind of label. And so, we can tell stories and share the good things they're doing, but oftentimes it comes down to some of them are looking for certifications.
Yeah. And then Claire, what you just mentioned about the challenge of some of these soil practices taking years to see the outcomes you want and needing kind of repeated practices year over year, and the challenge of rotations and not necessarily having control over what the next grower that comes in does with that land is really important. And I know that in the Central Coast, kind of crop rotations are, as John started off by saying, it's pretty, there's a lot of rotation going on there. So John, I just wanted to see if you had any comments on that, the challenge of the crop rotations and how that's playing out in the Central Coast, and then anything else that you can think of around some of the challenges of rewarding grower performance for outcomes in the work that you do.
Yeah, certainly we're adjusting to implementing sustainable practices like cover crops in our operations to get the knockdown time and the time between rotations. So we're figuring that out. Taylor is mostly, so we have our own ground, and then we contract by the acre and by the pound with growers. So we're definitely a different model, different relationship with our supply chain than Dan or Claire. And to be honest, we have work to do there in terms of incentivizing and educating that grower base. And really, we're starting with ourselves. We have 14,000 acres of organic and 6,000 of conventional. So we're taking this year kind of bear out the data and prove it to ourselves. We don't want to push things down on our supply chain that are impractical. And so, and sometimes we're doing that in collaboration with our grower partners, and I'm sure, as everyone knows, we're always talking to each other and trying to problem solve out there in the field. But I will bring up one other issue, and that really is it has to do with land tenure in California and on the Central Coast as well. And that's our incentive to make investments, long-term investments in the ground is difficult because we have short-term leases and the costs of the ground is so high. So that is definitely something that California has to address going forward, and certainly the Central Coast, and certainly probably fresh produce production and their margins on that. And again, the best way I have seen, and Dan and I have been on committees before, and I'm sure we've heard it and we can see it. Incentivizing and educating is the best tool that I can think of to get those farmers to be willing to take a risk, or be willing to take a chance, or to trust you to engage in a practice that eventually, the context of the conversation is that we should see benefits down the road in 3 to 5 years that should help you on your side. And I will say that I now have 150 acres dedicated to a regenerative organic program, and that is actually allowing me to do some of that long-term soil study, like Claire was mentioning. Like it's difficult if you're not going to be on the same ground all the time to really give your growers good information about what the microbiology, what your soil organic matter growth is, all of those interactions, and also I should mention water retention. I'll stop.
And John, I think, thank you for bringing up land tenure. It is such an important topic, and I just want to add, I think in some of those contracts, don't they also, the requirements are to kind of leave when you leave and you kind of hand it back over. Sometimes those requirements are that it's bare, it's clean. Is that correct? So that kind of goes in contrast with some of the kind of soil health desired practices.
Yeah, that is, being good neighbors right now means essentially leaving it as you found it, or leaving it as essentially ready operational as possible. But that doesn't mean there's cover crops on the, there's no beneficial insectaries planted around the farm or things like that. Long-term things that the master leaseholder potentially could be the responsible party for improving soil and diversity throughout the state.
Yeah. So we've talked about some of the challenges. We've also, throughout this, you've all talked about some of the solutions, some of the things you're doing. Some things I've heard kind of common across all of you are trying to understand and then communicate kind of what practices make the most sense and what the outcomes they could be expected are, so that growers kind of understand that, as well as trying to find different rewards to go directly to growers for making improvements, all the way to trying to communicate and kind of set tiers of grower performance and communicate that to buyers so that they can, or brands, so that they can then ideally start prioritizing where they spend their money to link up with their sustainability goals and efforts, and what they want to communicate to all of us that are on the phone that love eating all of this food that you're talking about. So before we open it up to audience Q&A, I just wanted to do a quick rapid fire from each of you of, what's one of the biggest challenges or opportunities that you see looking forward. So, 1 or 2 minutes each on that. Maybe Claire, then Dan, then John.
Sure. Okay. Opportunities and challenges. Well, I think I continue to think that the biggest challenges we deal with are making sure we can address this whole farm ecosystem and implement soil health practices that are meaningful and actually improve the health of the farm and the health of the crops that are being grown on it. So figuring out how to coordinate across fields and with different processors. And then another challenge is really measurement for us, and that kind of bleeds into the first example of being on a field and not coming back for 4 years, but being able to measure those improvements and then being able to incentivize the growers for it. So I know some of Dan and John are able to do that, but that's been a challenge in my work, is really being able to measure the benefits and then connect it to not our own corporate goals necessarily, but to our customers' corporate goals. And then say, this isn't just a nice to have, it costs money and it takes influence, but it also is pretty expensive, especially when we work in such complicated, large systems where, for example, if you're trying to put drip in, we can have a $40,000 project and that won't even cover half of the field. So it's figuring out how to connect when corporations want to help, when they have goals around soil health and water reduction, how can they meaningfully help? And I think that's connecting these soil health projects and outcomes to contracts. So not one-off projects necessarily, while that definitely helps to, as John said, educate and maybe incentivize by lowering the cost and sharing the risk. We need to link it to, I guess, real money, to contracts, so that they can feel those benefits, and so that the customers and the consumers downstream can really understand the value of these practices and the cost.
Yeah, great answer. I would add, we're in the wild west of carbon markets right now. But it's a fascinating opportunity in theory for growers, but we're in the Wild West, first of all. Lots of activity that's somewhat speculative right now. When you bring that back to California and specialty crops that we all work in, the science is even more scarce than it is for the big acre commodity crops in the Midwest. So gets even wilder when you try to apply carbon markets and carbon accounting to specialty crops. So it's an opportunity because there's lots of excitement. There's money theoretically available worldwide for helping growers adopt carbon accounting, carbon friendly practices that relate to soil health, but we're in the Wild West. The other interesting thing, everybody else has mentioned regenerative ag. I find that a fascinating topic. Again, lots of interest in the market. It's an opportunity. Really think it's fascinating. Challenge is that it's not well defined. So there's still some concern. How do we define it? How do we communicate it? But I find it interesting that in almonds, we kind of backed into some of the practices like cover crops, not for soil reasons, but for pollinator and biodiversity reasons. And now we're discovering that, hey, there's this whole regenerative suite of benefits that come along with doing things like cover cropping that benefits the pollinators and biodiversity and soil health and carbon sequestration and really a regenerative suite of benefits. So that's the exciting thing. But again, how do we define it? And then, water holding capacity. I mentioned the challenge of water in California. The good news, I think, is that my social media feed is starting to show some fascinating examples of growers learning to use cover crops with drip irrigation and seeing the benefits of it. Or this year when we had all the rain, fascinating pictures of orchards with cover crops draining beautifully next to orchards without cover crops that are flooded and having problems. So I think there's this growing awareness of the suite of regenerative benefits that are happening when we do these practices. So that's the opportunity and the excitement, but there are still these challenges of definition and science and stuff that we need to work through.
Yeah, that's super exciting, Dan. That's so cool. It really was amazing to see the difference between non-cover crop fields and cover crop fields in the Salinas Valley as well this winter, and definitely growers' eyeballs opening up. Which so in terms of what I'm looking forward to and what I'm hopeful about, I think in that vein is finding ways to implement both food safety and sustainable practices together. And I'm lucky enough to have an agronomist that got hired on at Taylor Farm, so now we can think through these things together. And one of the things that we're doing is, well, a few of the things that we're doing. So I mentioned before, when we plant an insectary along an irrigation line, it can create habitat over time. So now we're lily padding our insectary plantings throughout our crop planting, so that essentially there is no monitoring, there is no habitat created. Additionally, like when we're going to be doing cover crops this coming fall, we're going to use seed drills. We're going to essentially, the concept is to make it as close to the other operational practices on the farm as possible, so that there's limited changeover for the grower to have to adopt to manage the conservation space as well as the growing space. And that has its challenges, but if you make the equipment, you don't have to go back to the yard and change this piece of equipment and come back and do all these things, then you get better adoption and you get better spread use of the practices. And for me, I'm getting data, which is really important for me. As Dan was saying, like the science isn't quite there yet on a lot of this, especially in row crop or intense produce production. And we're really learning quite a bit with the technology now that we have to understand that. And I would add that technology is another one of those things that I'm pretty intrigued by. I can now bury a football in the field and walk by it and pick up what the soil moisture, soil temp, and other things that are the metadata that's going to help us understand really what's the benefit that we can talk about with water holding capacity, cover crop use, and soil health.
Great, thank you. There's so much in there, but I will just pick up on one thread, which is I happen to have a background ready for this, so I'll do this. That comparing the infiltration benefits given the flooding over the season. So this is Donnie Hicks. Thanks to Donnie Hicks, you can see in the background after one rain event, a cover cropped field and how it infiltrated the water versus a non-cover cropped field here in the ponding that lasted for a while. So I'll leave that up while we switch into Q&A. We have probably about 10-15 minutes. We've got to wrap up at 11:15. So I will get us started. One of the questions, and Dan, I think I'll kick this to you since you kind of alluded to this given the makeup of your growers, but the question is, as you consider buyer, retailer sustainability expectations or incentives, this person is observing that companies are gravitating towards larger growers, vertically integrated companies, as a greater sense of control over that. So how would those expectations affect mid-sized, smaller growers? And this says who are not part of a cooperative system, but I know you've worked in other systems before, so wondering if you can just talk a little bit about size and complexity that comes with lots of growers of smaller size versus fewer growers of larger size.
Yeah, that's a great question. It is something that we always struggle with. I mean, when I say we, the industry in general, at Blue Diamond, we prioritize treating our members the same, whether they're 5 acres or 5,000 acres, and building programs to match and bringing everybody along, because that's our mandate as a co-op. But the reality is, if you're a buyer, it's easiest to go to the largest operators who have the efficiency of scale to implement practices. That's just a reality. I think what we're seeing is, a growing awareness on the part of buyers that they need to bring everybody along, and you're not going to get your full scale if you just work with a handful of suppliers. So there's a growing evolution of awareness in the buyer community, which is great to see. There's additional government programs coming along to help bring everybody along as well. And then, the world of carbon accounting, theoretically, if we can work it out correctly, a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon, whether it's on a small farm or a big farm, and it should be priced accordingly. So, hopefully this is something that will enable farmers of any size to have some returns on their investments. But again, we're in the Wild West.
Thanks, Dan. And I'll just add in there, I think, we talked about measurement before, and that's another thing that often comes up is, just how do we create systems that for those smaller growers, medium-sized growers that are don't necessarily have the resources to go out and do a bunch of measuring and reporting and responding to questionnaires. How do we make sure that we're designing supply chain programs? And I would also throw in regulatory programs and other things that that are doable for smaller and mid-sized growers. So I wanted to move on to the next one, and I'll leave this up to maybe either John or Claire. What role can the nonprofit, so organizations like Sustainable Conservation and research community, play in supporting you in increasing the adoption of soil health practices with your growers?
John, unless you have a question or an answer, I can jump in.
Go for it, Claire.
Okay, because this is an exciting question for me, because I think we have agronomists on staff, and our sustainability team in the US is a team of 2. And so we are spending more and more time sort of organizing and coordinating these projects, managing these projects, but we don't have as much free time then to really explore what's the best way to measure these benefits. And so that's something we're really stuck on. And we would love to look into the nonprofit space or the university space to kind of help inform, the best practices, how to do these measurements and even new practices to try. But then the complexity comes with onion and garlic is not, I hate to say it, but it's not the sexiest crop. And so a lot of the research that is being done in California is focused on almonds or maybe dairies and leafy greens perhaps, but definitely not onion and garlic. And so as I sort of mentioned earlier, when we're talking, we have to figure out even what soil health is in root crops in some ways. We know generally what practices are good for the soil, but how do we incorporate that into our systems? And then how do we measure it? And so it would be great to have some support for our crop specific products. And then measurement, of course, can be more general, but still maybe I'll expand it to just say rotational crops. That's a challenge. So help there would be appreciated.
And I'll just add, I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of reasons why soil health practices are kind of low adoption rates in California. One of the many is that we have such a huge diversity of crops, right? That's one of the things that makes California so amazing for agriculture, over 400 different types of crops, but that makes it really hard to figure out, what works best in all of those different types of crops. We don't just have, 3 major crops that we're growing, so that adds complexity. John, unless there's anything burning you want to add to that, I can move on to another question.
I will just say that I will thank Sustainable Conservation for bringing me into workshops that highlighted these areas for me and really has helped me focus my efforts on these issues. And in terms of nonprofits that can provide support, it is bringing people together to have conversations. It has been fantastic. And thank you again for doing that. It has really helped me on my journey with addressing these issues and trying to find solutions.
Thanks, John. This should be a quick one, Claire. And we can pop in the website in the chat, but someone asked about the @Source tool and asked if that's available to others and brings up the Cool Farm tool. So just maybe really quick, kind of explain how your tool is different from some of the other sustainability tools like Cool Farm tool that's out there.
Sure, definitely similar to Cool Farm Tool. It uses the Eco Invent calculator. I'm not sure if that's what Cool Farm Tool uses, but it is B2B. So we'll share the website so you can definitely look at it and poke around and perhaps request a login. But generally how it works is for the customers that buy the product, let's say it's onion, they can see a donut that tells them what's the breakdown of carbon, water, and then there's some social metrics as well. But for what's the breakdown between processing, transportation, agriculture, and then you can further see a breakdown of, on the farm, how much of that impact is from pesticide, from fertilizer, from cultural practices, from diesel use, and so on and so forth. And then I can't remember where I was going with that, but it's by farmer group. And so we have ones that are reflective of our desert regions, one of the Central Valley, Tule Lake, Boardman, for onion, and then for garlic. And so you can really see the impact of different crops in different growing regions.
So similar to other tools, but this is one developed specifically for your customers that you work with. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so all the variables, like I've filled out Cool Farm Tool as well, and all the variables are very similar that they're asking for, like depth of pumping or diesel use or fertilizers, things like that.
Great. So I'll leave this one open to anyone. Where do you see ecosystem service payments fitting in, particularly in setting of greenhouse gases, water, biodiversity to help supply chains meet their sustainability goals?
I'll jump in on that one. We certainly are seeing increased interest on the part of food manufacturers to do insetting of their issues, their carbon, their water, their biodiversity goals. So we see RFPs to suppliers. What could you do with some money to do these things? So that's encouraging. We would like to see it more widespread at this point. Our farmers would like to see it more widespread at this point, but there's certainly much more activity in the space than I saw earlier in my career. I've been doing this for a long time.
And maybe for those that aren't steeped in this, could you explain the difference between, I think people are familiar with offsetting, but insetting?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the example I like to use is an offset in the world of agriculture might be, a Delta Airlines or, pick your airline that wants to offset their carbon emissions. They would buy carbon credits generated by a farm, for example. They're offsetting something done outside of agriculture by purchasing from within agriculture. An inset is when a company that is a food company, for example, has a supply chain in agriculture and they pay to reduce the impact within their supply chain. So the farmers within their supply chain. So it's an inset as opposed to an offset where they purchase something from outside of their world.
Thank you. I've got, I think we'll have time for two more questions, and maybe Claire or John, you can answer this one. Do your companies partner with input suppliers as you think about sustainability of input sources? So there's big difference in fertility and pest management products and where they come from and how they're manufactured. Some are more sustainable than others. So yes, this is kind of moving into a different part of the supply chain, but how are you looking at, or are you looking at the sustainability of the input products?
I'll briefly touch on it. Yeah, we do partner with specific input providers to us, and we do things like trial effectiveness and have close relationships with those folks. Can you back up and ask the question again? I'd lost my train of thought there.
Sure. Just how are you looking at the sustainability performance of the inputs themselves that your growers are using?
Yeah, I think we'll be looking at that more so over time. Right now, if you look at the supply chain around an organic pellet, chicken pellet, that supply chain is pretty domestic. But when you start looking at additions of minerals and nutrition, those fertilizer inputs can start spanning the globe. And so we definitely are looking at, in terms of the broader impact of our inputs, starting to begin to look at that supply chain to understand it. We don't see a lot of customer requests really driving that concern yet, but I think holistically where we're headed obviously is less dependence on off-farm inputs and more local or regional supply sources. So that all fits in with kind of the goals and where we're oriented.
Great, thanks. And this one, since we're short on time, Dan, go ahead, Claire.
Just to add, going back to the calculating of carbon emissions, I know there's a lot of inputs, or a few input providers at least, who have said, we can create this chemical that has half the emissions. And so that's of course intriguing to us, but the calculation tools aren't refined enough to actually capture that benefit. So that's something we think about as well.
Great, thanks, Claire. We are about out of time. I could have talked to you all for another hour or so at least. But just really wanted to thank you, Dan, Claire, and John, for being with us today and sharing your wisdom and your expertise. Very much appreciated. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something along the way. And just wanted to let you know that the next and final webinar in this Solutions in Our Soil series will be late June, and will be a deep dive conversation with two growers to understand their perspective, what they're doing, what others can do to support their efforts in the farm, and what we can all do to better communicate the importance of soils in building more resilient food systems. So that registration page will be up soon. Stay tuned for information via email or on our social media. Hope you can join us to hear from the growers. That's where it all starts. And if you would like to follow our work, Sustainable Conservation's work, you can find us on social media, subscribe to our email list, consider a donation. These webinars and our program work is fueled by generous contributions of organizations and individuals like you. So, and right now, all increased donations are currently being matched dollar for dollar. So consider donating anything that you'd like. You can join there's information there on the screen. You can scan that QR code. So thank you again for joining. We hope to see you again at the end of June. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks all.